Are you ready to do some It's Del Toro time though?
Yes, I am.
All right. Let's I guess just do let's just introduce
Guess
ourselves.
what?
And what?
I ate before this.
Guess what?
What?
I 9 before this.
What?
Like 8, 9.
Oh.
It's a funny joke.
I thought you were saying I took that in the German 9.
I 9. There was an old episode of Benny Hill. Of course, it was old because it's Benny Hill. Where Benny Hill plays this like German guy going into a German, or he's like a British officer going into a German bar, and the German bartender is all like, no. Sorry, he's German. He goes into a British bar, and the British bartender is all like, "Would you like a beer?" And he's all 9, and she's all 9 beers, and she serves him 9 beers. Funny jokes. Hey everybody, I'm Phil.
And I'm Willow.
And
It's
Del Toro
Toro
time. It's Del Toro time. And what are we not discussing today?
Movies.
At all.
Yeah.
There's not even a movie adaptation of what we're discussing today.
No offense to the story. It's a great story. That would make a pretty boring movie.
I believe that it is optioned, though. I believe that, like, Frank Darabont or somebody was attached to it for a while to adapt. It would have been a very... I wonder how they would have adapted this.
Boring.
Slow. Or absolutely nothing like this. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, Willow, what's the deal? What's the dealio?
Well, we can't watch movies together right now.
Right. Because of the plague.
Because of the death that's going to kill us all. So I was like, watching movies is boring by myself.
Yeah.
So we decided to take a break.
Yeah.
And then you suggested that we do this because we both have a copy of The Dark Descent.
And what's The Dark Descent?
It's a collection of spooks and sci-fi.
Yep.
And also old ladies, apparently.
Yes. The Dark Descent is like this massive collection of horror short stories put together by David G. Hartwell. Do you know anything about David G. Hartwell?
I know a lot because I just Googled him.
Okay, what can you tell us in brief about Mr. Hartwell?
He has one of the brightest shirts I've ever seen.
Or had, because he's deceased.
Dead. He's dead. He hit his head and died, unfortunately.
Oh, really?
Yeah. That's what it said on his Wikipedia page.
He hit his head? I did not know that.
Yeah. He was hospitalized after suffering severe head trauma from a fall at home.
Oh man, that's the saddest.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, he does have a bright t-shirt, a bright shirt. Look at that.
Yeah. One of the first things I read was he enjoyed, where was it? Personal life, the first sentence. Hartwell was known for flamboyant fashion choices.
Yes, I'm looking, actually, I Google image searched him, and there's a bunch. Mm-hmm. There's a bunch of bright shirts. A man after my own heart. Well...
He also dyed his hair.
He did? What a cool guy. I assume. I hope there's nothing terrible about him out there. But, so what was Mr. Hartwell known for?
Editing.
So he was an editor of many an anthology.
Yes.
I mean, he wrote. He also did some writing.
Yeah.
But, man, he did a ton of Year's Best Fantasies, Year's Best Sci-Fis.
I have his entire bibliography.
Do you?
In front of me. It's now in chronological order.
You are a master of the database.
I just clicked the links at the bottom of the wiki page.
Where did it send you to? The Internet Sci-Fi Database?
Yeah.
Oh, it did. Yes, I do enjoy the Internet Sci-Fi Database. For those of you out there who've never experienced the joys of the Internet Sci-Fi Database, if you really just want to find out every single place a short story you are looking for has ever appeared, that's your go-to. It's amazing.
Now, I don't want to, call anyone out.
Okay.
I read a profile of him by one of his friends.
All right.
And, it's written pretty well. There's just one part of it that drives me insane.
Yes.
This person who wrote this, it's short. 2 times he uses the phrase, grinning almost wolfishly. And I can't stand that phrase at all.
Grinning almost wolfishly.
And then he smiles almost, but not quite wolfishly. And I can't... I can't.
What is wrong with grinning almost wolfishly, in your
It's
opinion?
just, he's not like, I don't know, just the term wolfishly upsets me.
Oh, I see.
Because I associate that with like predators.
Mm-hmm.
And using it to describe someone engaged in conversation seems weird to me.
Well, obviously, someone else did not think so. Because they chose to describe a person they apparently enjoyed very much as grinning that way.
Almost.
Almost. So why are we discussing Mr. David G. Hartwell in the first
because he
place?
put this anthology together.
What anthology? We don't know what we're talking. We're working very backwards here.
We literally said The Dark Descent.
So for Christmas, I gave you you asked for a horror anthology, like a good
Yes.
horror anthology.
You gave me 2.
And I gave you 2, both by David G. Hartwell, but the first one is The Dark Descent, and it's this just it's honkin' big. It's a honkin' big anthology.
1,011 pages long.
From I believe 1987, 87 or 88, and it contains just a ton of horror stories that Hartwell considered like quintessential in the history of horror, but not in chronological order.
Nope.
Just sort of divided up by theme. Mm-hmm. A few years after he published it, because remember, it is honkin' big.
Yeah.
It was republished as 3 separate paperbacks, which were known as The Color of Evil.
Oh, I bet I can guess what the next one you're going to say
Guess
is.
what the next one is.
The Medusa and the Shield.
And what was the next one?
A Fabulous Formless Darkness.
Exactly. So there's three paperbacks, The Color of Evil, The Medusa and the Shield, and The Fabulous Formless Darkness, all of which I own. And what's funny is, when I gave you The Dark Descent, I did not, which I knew was like this very well-regarded horror anthology, I did not realize that I also own it in 3 separate volumes. Because nowhere on the outside of these books does it say they're a part of The Dark Descent.
Huh.
It just says The Color of Evil, edited by David G. Hartwell. And when you open it up and you get to the title page, that's where it says The Dark Descent Volume 1. Otherwise, it's just 3 horror anthologies. And so I was like looking at your collection and I was like, wait a minute, I've seen these stories together before. And it stands out because of the first story in the anthology. And
Yeah.
I finally got my collections together. I was like, this is the same thing. This is all the same thing. We have the same anthology. So, yes, I have a lot of horror anthologies. But no, this is Hartwell's. And I like Hartwell's because it's very eclectic. And so we decided that since we can't watch movies together,
We're gonna read these stories and then talk about them.
So what is the first book in the anthology?
The first book.
The first story in the anthology.
What a short book that was. It is by Stephen King.
Mm-hmm.
And it is The Reach.
And what can you tell us about Stephen King? Has anyone here heard of Mr. Stephen King?
He's probably, well, it says here above the story is the single most popular writer of horror fiction since Charles Dickens. So yeah, I think everyone's heard of.
That's a really weird way to put that.
Yeah.
I'm like, who's the most famous horror writer? Let's not count Charles Dickens. And I'm like, that's the first person you think of?
Yeah.
When you think famous horror writers?
I don't actually think of anyone.
I would say like since Edgar Allan Poe, or I don't know, maybe Charles Dickens. Maybe a lot of people bought that Christmas ghost story, but like I don't think of Dickens as like the
Was
go-to.
Edgar Allan Poe well received when he started writing though?
He is now.
Yeah, but I think they're talking more about like of the time.
Well, he is a pop culture phenomenon. He's the king of horror, just as Elvis Presley was the king of rock. This is a weird. He should have just said, "You know who Stephen King is," and left it at that.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is Mr. King's short story, "The Reach," which originally appeared as
Do the Dead Sing.
Yes, it was in the November 1981 issue of Yankee magazine. Yankee magazine. I think it's still published. At one point, it was like one of the most popular magazines being printed, but it's like the kind of magazine that's like top 10 favorite flannels.
So it's BuzzFeed. It's like BuzzFeed.
No. It's like articles about like, let's carve a stick into a smaller stick.
So,
like log cabin fun times.
So it's like a mix between BuzzFeed and 5 Minutes Crafts.
More like Buzzkill. It's a magazine that's kind of like and I am totally just massacring what Yankee Magazine actually is. But it's a magazine that I had very little interest in ever in my life. Stephen King, most of his early short stories were published in like men's magazines. It's a magazine about like New England living, like fall foliage and stuff like that. Like we were in New England, and yes, it still does exist, by the way. Wow, it still has a circulation of 300,000.
Damn. I read a post from someone talking about New England the other day. They were saying, like, you read Stephen King and you're thinking he's making it all up, and then you go and you live in New England for a while. And you're like, yeah, okay.
So yeah, but it's like when I think of Stephen King's early short stories, or his short stories in general, he used to be published in like nudie mags, like Atom magazine. Like
wasn't that really common though for horror and stuff?
Oh, totally, yeah. Just like whatever would pay you, whoever needed to fill their pages with text so they weren't like pulled from circulation for being pure pornography. Like, and yeah, so he sold a bunch of his stories. Back in the early days of like his like anthologies, he was just his collections of short stories. He'd always be like, I don't have any original copies of these anymore, so if anyone ever finds an old magazine with it in it. But so it was originally called Do the Dead Sing. He always wanted to call it The Reach, so when it came time for him to republish it in one of his own, I think Night Shift, he changed it back to The Reach, and also, as he does, substantially rewrote it.
Oh yeah.
So if you ever want to read the original version of The Reach, you're going to have to find the November 1981 copy of Yankee Magazine on like eBay.
It's probably in like some database at some point by now.
I've looked. You gotta buy that Yankee Magazine, and it's expensive because it's the one with a Stephen King story in it.
Maybe my library has it at school.
So this is an interesting story to kick off a massive horror anthology with. Yes,
it is.
Why?
Well, I mean, I guess in some ways it could be considered horror.
Uh-huh.
Like, I can see how the subtle threat of impending death could spook some people.
Right.
But as someone who is living as an 18-year-old, death seems pretty far away.
Yep. Even though culturally we are surrounded by the threat of death.
It's kind of just about an old lady.
This is a story that I, of course, have read many times in my later life, but when I first read it when I was in junior high, I was like, well, never need to read this again. This is not scary at all. And I just flipped to the next story. Now, I shimmy and shake, and I cry copious tears every single time I read this story. It is, to me, it is incredibly moving and frightening.
I think the scariest part for me wasn't even because of, like, the threat of death. It's because of my, like, severe medical anxiety.
Uh-huh.
And reading symptoms and stuff like that always freaks me out.
Yeah. And
there was some discussion of some symptoms in there.
Right, especially near the end.
Yeah, and that was upsetting.
So a quick rundown. This is about an old woman named Stella Flanders. She's 95, and she lives on Goat Island, which is like just near Portland, Maine. It's like right off the coast of Maine. The island is separated from the mainland by
the Reach,
which is
a large body of water.
Yep. It's basically just like a body of water that separates like two land masses.
Yeah, except for it's not a river.
Right.
Or a lake.
It is not a lake at all. It's a reach. And I think it's kind of like I assume that's more of like a northeast, like New England-y area expression.
Yeah.
Because even she acknowledges in the short story that it might not be one that people are familiar with anymore. Like she thinks that her grandchildren would ask to have it explained to her.
Yeah.
She's never left Goat Island in her entire life. Even though she's been tempted to, even though like people have asked her like to do it, she never had a reason to leave. And now she is at the end of her life, and
she starts seeing things like her dead husband, except for he's young again.
Yeah, he's not like a scary monster.
No.
He's not like a ghost. Like, well, he is like a ghost, but he's not like a creepy ghost.
Yeah.
Most of the story is told as sort of a series of like flashbacks to her life that fill you in on who this woman is and what she's experienced.
There's a lot of death.
Yeah, and all the people in her life who've kind of passed out of her life. And just like how that goes. Like her best friend, her husband, various just neighbors, and this story isn't very long.
No, it's 15 pages.
Oh, and by the way, I was wrong. This was not in Night Shift. This is in Skeleton Crew, his book.
Yeah, I have Night Shift, and I was like, I don't know what you're talking about, but okay.
This story, even though it is very short, names and goes into about 50 different characters.
Yep.
You get to, and you don't just he doesn't just toss them off. You kind of get to know some of these people pretty well. Mm-hmm. And yeah, a lot of them died, and some of them in horrible ways, some of them in stupid ways.
Some of them get murdered.
Some of them get murdered. Some of them are wee babies who are killed by their midwife. Mm-hmm. For various reasons. But a lot of the themes in this story are about like how people in this sort of isolated community take care of each other. They forgive each other. They remember one another, and they mourn for one another, and then they move on with their lives. Mm-hmm. There's like a description of funerals that are just like, you have your funeral, you sing your song, you go to the basement of the church, you have like
cream cheese sandwiches.
You have cream cheese sandwiches, and you go on the next day and you get on with living. Mm-hmm. So Stella, she seems like a nice enough woman.
Yeah.
Pretty fair person. Just she's never had an exciting life. She has a son who lives with her.
Alden.
And yeah, her husband was Bill. Her son is Alden, and he's like 60 or so. He's like he's up there.
She's 95, so
right. So he still lives at home. There's a few characters who get covered extensively, and what is her best friend from childhood? Is it Annabelle?
Maybe?
Well, they talk a lot about her best friend and her best friend's husband. And I mean, as you can see, there's not like a whole lot of story. It's mostly filling in the gaps of this community. Mm-hmm. You do find, we alluded to this, 2 anecdotes. Yes. One about a little baby.
The baby was born with some disability.
Yeah, it's referred to as something very un-PC now.
Yeah.
So it was basically, you could tell it was born with severe disability.
Yeah.
And what happened to that baby?
They killed it.
Yeah. So it was delivered by a midwife. They invited the mother out of the room. Mm-hmm. And while she was out of the room, the midwife somehow killed the baby, and they buried it as if it were a natural death. And then the next story in that little section is about a man named Daniels.
Who deserved it.
Who was caught for molesting 3 little girls.
Yep.
And they sort of take you through the whole story of like how he was inappropriate with these little girls, and they described the man. They found out who it was. And what happened to him?
They killed him.
And his death was blamed on an accident. And he was actually given a funeral and buried on the island as if he just died of an accident. And
even the former reverend was in on it.
And life went on. Yeah, I think Alden was in on it.
No, her husband and Alden, yeah.
Yeah, Bill and Alden, like all the men just got together and quietly killed this man. Didn't get the authorities involved. And that's this whole chapter, is this whole little section, not even chapter, section of the short story about how like the island cares for its own. Like you care for your own. Like, and even the death of the baby is presented as like this like tragic mercy that because there's no services on the island. Like, and I'm not saying it was right, but like, and she's not even saying it was right, but it was just the function of the island, and everyone just kind of works together, and you do what has to be done. And anyone familiar with Stephen King's way of writing about New England is familiar with this sort of attitude of like, you do the ugly work and you get on with your life.
Well, like this seems like a very, very small town.
Yeah.
No joke considering Stephen King wrote this. But
Yeah. So Stella starts seeing all these ghosts. This is, and only once, one of the themes is only once in her life has the Reach ever frozen. Mm-hmm. And when it did, her husband and his friend walked across the Reach, and they invited her along, and she declined to go. But they walked across, and at the time, that was like, what? You walked across the Reach all the way to the mainland? Because you can see the mainland, like, from your window. Like, you can, and with a pair of binoculars, you can, like, make out, like, signs and stuff. Like, it's not terribly far away as the crow flies, but it's a body of water, and so only once in history has it ever frozen that she knows of, and that was this one winter that was brutal, and it didn't snow.
Or it snowed the first winter. It didn't snow this winter.
And then the Reach freezes. Mm-hmm. And when it freezes, it's not like fun. Like the ice skaters try to go out, but it's frozen all wobbly like. Mm-hmm. So it's just like this sort of like weird event that happens. Like all of a sudden there it is. And people go out, I guess 2 guys go out in their
Sled?
They crash through the ice. Like it's not frozen enough.
And then they die. Well, one of them dies.
One of the guys dies. Like that's just life. And like they have his funeral and life goes on.
How many funerals does that make it in this story?
There's a lot of funerals in this story. In a way, it reminds me of there's a very famous play called The Playboy of the Western World, and it's an Irish play. And in Ireland, because so many of the men were fishermen, wakes and funerals were just part of daily life. Like you'd go out and just another guy wouldn't return, so you'd have your wake, and that story is sort of built around funerals and wakes especially. And that reminds me a lot of this. Like it's this sort of funeral based community because you're surrounded by water and people are going to go out and they're going to die, and you're very isolated from the hospital. So
yeah, and it seems like the town is slowly dwindling.
Yes.
As well, because the young people are moving away. So the town is slowly dying itself.
Right. There's this great theme of like loss but also like loss as just part of progress. Like people are the goat island she lives on doesn't resemble the goat island she grew up on as much anymore. Mm-hmm. And so the reach freezes and she's been seeing the ghosts of her husband, and he's been calling to her and he keeps asking her, do you love? And that's like kind of that's a recurring theme in Skeleton Crew. Actually, Stephen King rewrote a lot of the short stories in Skeleton Crew to incorporate this phrase, do you love? And it has like different meanings depending on which story you're reading it in, but she keeps like being asked like, do you love? Do you love? And that's like this like weird like question that keeps like sort of popping up.
And she keeps saying, I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's kind of heartbreaking. Like this woman who's in her mid 90s, like she can't even tell you if she's ever actually loved in her life. And so one night, it just sort of like the time is right. She's and tell us about her medical condition. So
she has cancer.
Yeah. You pretty much find out at the end that she kind of has cancer of the everything.
Yeah.
But she's known for years that she has cancer, and it's like old people cancer, like where like you get so old, you're like, well, I'm not gonna call a doctor. Like, what's the point? Like, what are they gonna do? Put me in surgery that's gonna like be worse than the disease? Yeah. So she just kind of keeps her eye on it. Like she'll have blood, she'll just deal with it. She doesn't tell anyone about it. It's just part of her life, and she goes on about her business. Mm-hmm. But this one night. It was even like, no, it's not night. It's a day. It's just one day. She just puts on her husband's long johns and his hat, throws on
her son's.
Oh, it's her son's. Right. Because it's not her husband's, because that comes up. Yeah, she puts on her son's like warm clothes and a big coat, throws on a hat, and she just decides to set out across the reach.
Yep.
And that's kind of like the final chunk of this story is her journey across the reach.
Yeah, her journey through the snowstorm.
Yeah, because it begins snowing, and then she loses her way, kind of. But her husband taught her how to navigate in a snowstorm. Mm-hmm. And it's like you let your dominant leg go limp. Mm-hmm. You act as if it's been hurt, so you don't favor it anymore, because otherwise you'll walk in a circle. Even when she realizes that she has been like favoring her dominant leg, that's when she like lets it go limp and she straightens out. She's trying to make it across to the mainland. It becomes whiteout conditions. Eventually she starts falling, and that's when the ghost of her husband appears and helps her up. And then she falls again.
The hat keeps trying to get away as well.
Right. Well, it is like the wind keeps trying to take the hat.
No. The hat keeps trying to get away.
That's true. It keeps talking and saying like, let me go. Please, let me go free. No, the wind is, the hat almost keeps like leaving her head. And finally it does. And what happens?
Her husband is like, hey, have my hat.
Yeah, like he puts his ghost hat on her.
Ghost hat.
But she keeps falling, and eventually like her best friend helps her up. Like bit by bit, more and more ghosts appear on the reach. And they kind of just walk with her till she finds a place to sit. And that's when she realizes she's made it to the other side.
It just says Stella, she heard voices but was not sure they actually spoke. I'm going to say singing because it sounds better.
Well, and it says at the end, that as the wind screams around it, some kind of song burst from her. They all sang then, as children will sing in their high, sweet voices, as a summer evening draws down to summer night. They sang, and Stella felt herself going to them and with them finally across the reach. If you want me to cry in a story, be it a movie, a play, a novel, a short story, what have you, all you have to do is have a scene at the end where the ghosts of everyone you've lost along the way show back up in a group to comfort one of the main characters. That is it. That is like one of my biggest buttons.
Yep.
Longtime Companion did it. Oh God, I'm blanking now. The non-fiction story Isaac's Storm about the Galveston hurricane did it. This does it. A million other stories have done it, and I'm a blubbery mess at the end.
For me, it's when like the main character's like a kid and their mom shows back up after dying, like as a spirit.
Oh yeah.
That's what gets me.
That wrecks me too. So, and it's when she starts noticing. So Annabelle shows up to help her out. So Bill is there, Annabelle is there, and it says.
I like the description of Annabelle's dress.
What does it say?
The yellow dress, which had been considered daring in its day, but to Annabelle's credit and to everyone else's relief, not quite a scandal.
Yeah, and it capitalizes daring and scandal. Like, those are titles. And it says, Tommy Frame had joined Annabelle. Big George Havelock, who had died a dog's death in the woods, walked behind Bill. There was the fellow who had kept the lighthouse on the head for most of 20 years, and who used to come over to the island during the cribbage tournament Freddie Dinsmore held every February. Stella could almost but not quite remember his name. And that was Freddie himself. Walking off to one side of Freddie by himself and looking bewildered was Russell Bowie. I think Russell Bowie was the guy who fell through the ice.
Yeah.
And was a little embarrassed by that. Annabelle, Freddie, Russell, John, Eddie, Frank. Take my hand, my hand. And then Bull Symes shows up. He was a character who got talked about. And he's like, when she said it's time. And she cries at that moment. She bursts into tears. And it says repeatedly throughout the story that things had happened and she hadn't cried about it.
Yeah.
And now she cries. When they find her body, they find her wearing her husband's hat. And only her son, of course, realizes this.
And some of the other people in the...
Oh, really?
Yeah, I think so.
I guess in that community you would recognize someone's hat.
Was Alden to tell David and Lois that the cap on her head had not been his? Larry McKean had recognized that cap, so had John Benson. He had seen it in their eyes, and he supposed they would have seen it in his.
He had not lived long enough to forget his dead father's cap, the look of its bill, or the places where the visor had been broken. But one of the things that she says when she's dying is she takes Bull's hand, and she says, yes, I will. Yes, I did, and yes, I do. Yes, I will, yes, I did, yes, I do. Finally answering the question, do you love? And I think it took her that full extent of her life to realize that she will always love, that she did always love, and that she does love. There's a commentary. I've read several commentaries on this story because it's been written about by different people, blogged about. And there was one by a reverend who did a blog post about it, saying this is probably the most religious short story that Stephen King ever wrote. Not explicitly religious, but that sort of addresses the notion of life after death from a don't worry, you're going somewhere, you won't be forgotten, and your love will live on after you. Like, the love you experienced throughout your life was important, and it did affect people. And I think one of the reasons this story affects me a lot now is, of course, I'm older, and I do worry a lot about this kind of stuff. I worry about dying. I worry about the people I leave behind, and I worry, have I made an impact? And I think that one of the brilliant things about this story is that this woman who never left her home, she stayed in the same island her entire life, still had an impact simply by loving and for being loved and loving in return. Like that was enough. And her son realizes this at the end. Do the dead sing and do they love? And on those long nights alone with his mother, Stella Flanders, at long last in her grave, it often seemed to Alden that they did both. And it's it's a very gentle story to begin an anthology called The Color of Evil.
Yep.
Like, you pick it up, there's a skull on the cover peeking out between two cracks, like, hello. It's like The Color of Evil written in like these like bloody jagged letters.
I think I know exactly what book you're talking about.
Yep. And I think it's fascinating that Hartwell was like, this is it. This is the perfect story to begin a discussion of horror with, because it is so gentle. And I think it's about like the horror of just simply confronting the fact of death and the notion of loss and the fear of leaving everyone you loved behind, and the horror of wondering, was my life well lived? And confronting that question. I don't know, like, what do you think about it?
Well, I was doing some internet browsing, because that's what I do in my spare time, because I'm a teenager. And I came across, I can't remember what it's from, but there was a quote that really stuck with me. It's not a quote. Well, it is a quote from the post, but it was not quoted. You know?
Yeah.
Okay. And it said, if nothing you do matters, then the only thing that matters is what you do.
And how did this story make you reflect on that?
Well, I don't believe in anything. But I don't not believe in anything. I think there are too many questions that will never be answered by anything.
Yeah.
I'd like to think there's something after death.
Mm-hmm.
Just because it's a comforting thought. But I honestly don't know.
What's interesting is in recent years, King has gone back. He doesn't touch on, like, beyond, like, just having ghosts. Mm-hmm. He doesn't really touch on the afterlife much. But very recently, in the last, like 5 or so years, he did the novel Revival, which I thoroughly enjoyed. I think it's a devastating book, but it touches on what happens after death, and it is devastatingly pessimistic compared to The Reach. It is not what you want to read if you are looking for anything comforting. And I find it interesting that this story, which he wrote when he was in his early 30s, but which is about like the reflections of a vastly older person reflecting on death, that this story is the one that is the most like positive, forward looking, and that the later story in his career is the one that's like nothing good's coming up. Nothing good is going to come of this.
I actually think that makes sense. In my opinion, it feels like it makes sense.
Yeah.
I just think that when you get older, you get more pessimistic. That's just something I've noticed. And I feel like the closer you get to death, the more anxious you get about it, and the more your mind floats to all of these horrible possibilities.
Do you think I've gotten more pessimistic as I've gotten older?
I don't know. I only remember you from my childhood, and I was a weird child. I had a complicated upbringing. I wasn't exactly. I wouldn't say I knew exactly how everyone was feeling all the time.
That's true. Probably unfair to expect you to know exactly what was going on. So this book was published in. The story was published in, of course, The Dark Descent. It was published in Skeleton Crew, and in the Dark Descent, Color of Evil. I just realized that if you get the British edition of The Color of Evil, it does say The Dark Descent on the cover, but it's spelled Colour of Evil, like they do in England.
Stupid Englanders.
They've also The Color of Evil was reprinted in 2016. With a different order. Like they rearranged the orders of the short stories, which I find unjustifiable. So
honestly, why would you do that?
So we are definitely using the original order, because otherwise it would be confusing. So speaking of the original order, Willow, what is the next story in the anthology?
Evening Primrose by John Collier. Collier.
The Evening Primrose by John Collier, which I am looking forward to discussing because it is
It's even shorter than this one.
It's very short, it's very weird, and it's going to be very fun to talk about because there is a musical based on this short story.
Oh, no.
Written by Stephen Sondheim. That is
yes.
a very short TV musical based on a horror short story that plays like a Twilight Zone episode, written by Stephen Sondheim, starring Anthony Perkins of Psycho fame. Join us for that, I guess. And if you want to get your hands on a copy of this anthology, it is available used in many locations. So until then, until we take a deep dive into that dark, depressing department store, I'm Phil.
And I'm Willow.
And we'll see you when it's Del Toro time.